Thanksgiving used to be predictable. Same driveway, same house, same expectation that I would show up early and leave quietly once I'd served my purpose. That year I arrived with a pie still warm in its tin and a calm I'd learned to wear after decades of discipline. I didn't expect the door to stay closed. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. I am 66 years old. I spent my career in work that punished mistakes and rewarded precision. Numbers had to reconcile. Records had to align. If something didn't make sense, you didn't ignore it. You corrected it. That Thanksgiving afternoon, nothing made sense. I rang the bell once, then again. Through the front window, I could see the dining table already set. Plates out, wine poured, people moving around. This wasn't a misunderstanding. The door finally opened just enough for my son's wife to step into the frame. She looked relieved, not surprised. "You shouldn't be here," she said. I waited for my son to appear behind her. He didn't. "I was invited," I replied. She smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Plans changed." I took a breath. "Then he can tell me himself." She didn't turn around. She didn't call for him. Instead, she folded her arms and said the words that snapped something permanently into place. "You're not family anymore." No shouting, no drama, just dismissal. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, long enough to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't emotion. It was calculation. They had decided I was no longer useful, and therefore disposable. I nodded once, turned around, and walked back to my car. I didn't knock again. I didn't call. I didn't argue. That night I ate alone. The next morning I reviewed my accounts, not out of spite, out of clarity. For years I had quietly supported them. Help with mortgage gaps, business loans signed under my name, emergency transfers that were never repaid. I had framed it as family helping family. But family apparently had an expiration date. By noon I had made the decision they never thought I would make. I cut off every form of financial support. No announcements, no speeches, no warnings. Automatic transfers stopped, guarantees revoked, accounts separated, permissions removed cleanly, legally, completely. Then I blocked both of them. Within an hour, my phone exploded, 110 missed calls, voicemails stacking on top of each other. Messages from unknown numbers, calls from friends suddenly checking in. Panic has a sound. I let it ring. Because here's what they didn't understand. I didn't cut them off because I was angry. I cut them off because they told me who I was to them. And once someone shows you that, the only mistake is continuing to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. That was the moment the balance shifted. They still believed this was a misunderstanding. I already knew it was a correction. And by the time they realized what they had lost, financially, emotionally, permanently, it was already too late to negotiate. The silence didn't last long. It never does when money disappears. By the second morning, the missed calls had turned into messages. Long ones, careful ones. The kind written after someone realizes anger won't work and decides to try reason instead. "There must be some mistake. We need to talk. This is serious." I didn't respond. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my ledger the way I used to at the end of every quarter. Same pen, same posture, same discipline. I wasn't looking for justification. I was documenting closure. Years of quiet assistance stared back at me in clean rows. Mortgage shortfalls I covered without discussion. Credit cards I paid off after promises to handle it next month. A business venture my son insisted would take off if I just helped him bridge the gap. I had bridged every gap, and they had closed the door. By noon, the calls stopped. That's when the knock came. I didn't have to look through the window to know who it was. I recognized the rhythm, hesitant, then firm, then impatient. I didn't open the door. "Dad," my son called through the wood. "Please." I stayed where I was. "We need to fix this," he said. "She didn't mean it like that. Meanings don't matter after actions." "You embarrassed us," his wife added, louder now. "You made a scene." I almost laughed. A scene would have involved shouting, or pleading, or refusing to leave. All I had done was listen. "You're overreacting," she continued. "You can't just cut us off." There it was. Not shouldn't. Can't. That word told me exactly how they had always seen me. I stepped closer to the door, close enough for my voice to carry without rising. "You told me I wasn't family anymore," I said. "This is what that sounds like in practice." Silence. Then my son again. Quieter now. We were stressed. "Holidays get complicated." "No," I said. "Respect is simple." They stood there for a while longer, long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to realize the door wasn't going to open. Eventually, footsteps retreated. By evening, the calls resumed. Not directly from them. From intermediaries. My sister. An uncle. A family friend who hadn't spoken to me in years but suddenly cared deeply about reconciliation. Each message followed the same pattern. "They're worried. They didn't expect this. You know how she is." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I called my bank. Not to complain. To confirm. Everything had been executed cleanly. No loose ends, no temporary holds, no gray areas. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day, the tone shifted. My son's wife emailed me. Subject line: "Let's be adults." She wrote about family bonds, about history, about how cutting off financial support was extreme. She mentioned my age, my health, my need for connection. She didn't mention Thanksgiving. She didn't mention the door. She didn't mention the words she'd chosen so carefully. I deleted the email. That afternoon, I received a notification from my accountant. Someone had tried to inquire about a transfer. Not authorized, not successful. I forwarded it to my attorney. He called me within the hour. "They're scrambling," he said. "This kind of panic only happens when someone built their life on an assumption." "Which assumption?" I asked. "That you'd always be there to catch them." I ended the call and sat quietly for a moment. Then I did something I should have done years earlier. I changed my will. Not out of spite, out of alignment. That evening, my phone lit up again. 110 missed calls now showed as a number instead of a blur. They had tried everything except apology. And that omission mattered. Because what they wanted wasn't forgiveness. It was restoration. Of money. Of access. Of control. They weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid of losing what I provided. I turned the phone face down and poured myself a drink I didn't finish. Somewhere they were telling each other this would blow over. That I was emotional. That I'd calm down once I realized how serious things had become. They were wrong. For the first time in years, everything was exactly as it should be. Clear, balanced, final. And while they were still searching for leverage, I had already moved on to something they didn't expect. Enforcement. Because when people mistake kindness for obligation, the correction is never gentle. It's precise, and it lasts. They stopped calling me directly after that. Not because they'd accepted anything, but because they'd realized I wasn't responding to noise. When panic fails, people change strategy. They look for authority. That's when the letters started. The first came from a law firm with a polished logo and language designed to sound calm while implying urgency. It suggested we clarify expectations and avoid unnecessary escalation. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on my desk without responding. By the end of the week, a second letter arrived. Different firm, sharper tone. It mentioned my age. It mentioned my recent emotional decisions. It suggested that my actions might not reflect my long-term interests. That one made me smile. I'd spent 40 years in a profession where people tried to reframe mistakes as concern. I recognized the tactic immediately. When you can't win on facts, you question capacity. I forwarded both letters to my attorney. He called me an hour later. "They're bluffing," he said. "But they're also scared." "Of what?" I asked. "Of exposure," he replied. "And of running out of money." That aligned with what I'd already confirmed. Within days of the cutoff, my son's accounts had dipped below thresholds I knew he relied on. Credit lines tightened. Automatic payments bounced. The business he'd insisted was temporary suddenly needed capital it didn't have. All of it had been cushioned by me, quietly. I hadn't just been support, I had been the structure. That weekend, my son showed up again. This time alone. He stood on my porch longer than the last time. Hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped in a way I didn't recognize. He looked older, thinner. The confidence he'd worn for years had been replaced by something closer to calculation. "Dad," he said when I opened the door just enough to be seen. "Can we talk?" I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood there in the cold, Two men who shared blood but no longer shared assumptions. She didn't mean it, he said quickly. Things just got heated. She meant it enough to say it, I replied. She was stressed. So was I said. Standing on your porch. He swallowed. We didn't think you'd take it this far. There it is, I said. He frowned. What? That sentence, I replied. You thought there were limits on my self-respect. He looked away. We need help, he said finally. Just until things stabilize. I shook my head once. That part of our relationship is over. His face hardened. So that's it? You're punishing us? No, I said. I'm enforcing reality. He stepped closer. You're ruining us. I met his eyes. You did that when you let someone tell me I wasn't family. For a moment he looked like he might argue, then he looked tired. This doesn't have to be permanent, he said. Neither did your words, I replied. He left without another sentence. That night the calls returned. Not frantic this time. Measured. Offers to apologize, promises to talk. Messages hinting at reconciliation dinners and fresh starts. None of them addressed the money directly anymore. That told me how bad it was. By Monday morning my attorney called again. They've asked for mediation, he said. Formal this time. I'm listening, I replied. But, he continued, they want temporary financial relief as a condition. I laughed softly. Then they're not ready. No, he agreed. They're desperate. I declined mediation. Not because I didn't want peace, because peace built on leverage isn't peace. It's extortion with nicer language. That afternoon I finalized changes I'd been delaying for years. Trusts restructured. Beneficiaries updated. Emergency clauses activated. Not to punish, to protect. By evening word had spread. People who once praised my generosity now whispered about my coldness. People who'd benefited quietly now wondered if they were next. Let them wonder. Discipline doesn't announce itself. It simply removes options. As I sat in my living room that night, my phone lit up again. Voicemail after voicemail. 110 missed calls had become a pattern. A reminder. Not of guilt, but of how loud entitlement gets when it realizes the money is truly gone. And this time, I knew something they didn't. The worst was still ahead for them. Because once financial dependence breaks, emotional leverage usually tries one last move, and I was ready for it. The emotional move came right on schedule. It always does when money stops working. I found out through my attorney, not through a phone call or a message. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They're questioning your capacity, he said calmly. Formally. I nodded once. Of course they are. A petition had been filed. Carefully worded, polite on the surface. It expressed concern for my well-being. It cited my age, my recent withdrawal, my uncharacteristic financial decisions. They weren't accusing me of wrongdoing. They were suggesting I couldn't be trusted with my own life. That's the moment most people panic. I didn't. Because this wasn't my first time watching someone confuse discipline with instability. They're trying to force temporary control, my attorney continued. Emergency access, oversight. Do they have anything? I asked. No, he said, but they're hoping noise will substitute for proof. I smiled. Then let's give them silence and documentation. We moved quickly. Independent evaluation, comprehensive, thorough. No shortcuts, no friendly doctors, no room for doubt. The report came back clean. Clear judgment, full cognitive capacity, no impairment. We attached it to a response that was as short as it was devastating. The claims are unfounded. That same afternoon, my sister called. They're saying you're being manipulated, she said quietly. By whom? I asked. There was a pause. They won't say. Then it's fiction, I replied. She sighed. They're scared. They should be careful, I said. Fear makes people sloppy. That evening, my son tried again. He didn't knock. He sat on the porch steps like he used to when he was a teenager, waiting for me to come home from work. I don't recognize you, he said when I stepped outside. I don't recognize this situation either, I replied. You're choosing money over family. No, I said evenly. I'm choosing self-respect over dependence. He rubbed his face with both hands. She's under a lot of pressure. So was I said, standing on that porch. His jaw tightened. You could end this tonight. Yes, I said. By pretending nothing happened, I won't. He looked up at me then, eyes sharp. So you're really going to let us fail? I leaned against the railing. I'm going to let you live with the consequences of your decisions. He stood abruptly. You think this makes you strong? I know it makes me consistent, I replied. He left without saying goodbye. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Temporary. Preliminary. Designed to intimidate more than decide. I showed up early. They arrived together. My son stiff. His wife composed, lips pressed tight, eyes scanning the room like she was already counting exits. Their attorney spoke first. Concern, isolation, sudden changes, emotional distress. My attorney responded with documents, timeline, financial history, Thanksgiving date, the exact moment everything changed. Then he did something I hadn't asked for. He read her words aloud. You're not family anymore. Not dramatically, just plainly. The room shifted. The judge looked up. That statement occurred before the financial decisions? Yes, my attorney said. The judge nodded once. That matters. The motion was denied, not postponed. Denied. Outside the courtroom, my son finally spoke. This didn't have to go this far. It went exactly as far as it needed to, I replied. That night the calls came again. Fewer than before, slower, careful. They weren't calling to argue now. They were calling to survive. I didn't answer. Because by then the message was clear. They had lost financial support, they had failed to regain control, and they had just burned their last emotional card. What remained wasn't reconciliation. It was fallout. And fallout doesn't negotiate. It settles where it settles. I went home, locked the door, and slept deeply for the first time since Thanksgiving. Because discipline had done what shouting never could. It had ended the argument. And the ending finally was inevitable. Once the court closed the door on them, reality rushed in fast. The phone calls didn't stop, but they changed. No more accusations. No more threats dressed up as concern. Now the messages were shorter, clipped, and carefully worded, as if every sentence had been rehearsed in advance. We just need a little time. Things are tight right now. You wouldn't let your own son lose everything. That last one almost worked. Almost. I knew exactly how tight things were. I'd seen the numbers before anyone else ever did. I knew which payments were late, which accounts were bleeding, which obligations had been quietly propped up by my transfers for years. They hadn't been living independently. They had been floating, and I had been the water beneath them. My attorney called me midweek. They're asking for a settlement, he said. On what terms? I asked. They want partial reinstatement, temporary assistance, a structured plan. Attached to what? I asked. Reconciliation, he said carefully. There it was. They weren't asking for forgiveness, they were asking for funding. I told him no. Not harshly, not angrily, just no. That afternoon my son came alone again. This time he didn't knock or shout. He stood in the driveway until I noticed him through the window. When I stepped outside, he didn't meet my eyes right away. We're drowning, he said. I waited. The business is failing, he continued. The house is behind. Creditors are calling. I nodded. I know. He looked up sharply. You know? I've always known, I said. I just chose not to interfere. He clenched his jaw. Then why won't you help now? Because now it would reward the wrong lesson. His voice cracked. You're choosing to watch us fall. No, I said calmly. I'm choosing not to lie to you anymore. He paced a few steps, hands shaking. She says you're doing this to hurt us. I shook my head. I'm doing this because you told me I didn't belong. That was her, he said quickly. And you let it stand, I replied. Silence stretched between us. She wants to apologize, he said finally. I looked at him. For what? He hesitated. For how it came out. I exhaled slowly. That's not an apology. He swallowed hard. Then what do you want? I didn't answer immediately. I want accountability, I said at last. Not promises, not panic, accountability. He stared at me, confused. That means you figure out your finances without me, I continued. You learn what support actually costs. You decide whether respect is optional or required. He shook his head. You're being cruel. No, I said. I'm being honest. He left without another word. That night I received another message from his wife. Short, direct, no warmth at all. If we lose the house, that's on you. I deleted it. The following week, the first asset went, then the second. I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat, I observed, because there's a difference between revenge and consequence. Revenge seeks pain. Consequence delivers clarity. By the end of the week, they stopped calling. Not because they were at peace, because there was nothing left to say that could reopen what had closed. I sat alone in my living room reviewing documents I hadn't needed to touch in years and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief, not from winning, but from no longer being responsible for choices I didn't make. They had wanted independence. They had demanded it loudly on a holiday meant to remind people where they belong. I had given it to them. Fully, financially, emotionally, completely. And the hardest part wasn't watching them struggle. It was accepting that they had always believed I would stop them from falling. They were wrong. Because some lessons don't come from support. They come from standing alone long enough to understand what support was actually worth, and that understanding once learned never fades. Not for them, and not for me. The end came quietly. No apology tour, no dramatic reunion, no last-minute reversal designed to soften what had already hardened. It came in the form of absence. Weeks passed without a single call. No messages routed through relatives, no carefully worded emails pretending to seek peace. The noise had finally stopped, and when silence arrived, it stayed. That was how I knew it was over. I heard about the aftermath indirectly. Not through gossip, but through fragments that reached me the way truth usually does. Uninvited and unembellished. The business folded. The house went on the market. They moved somewhere smaller, farther away, quieter. Independence has a price when you haven't budgeted for it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt confirmation. For years, I had mistaken obligation for love and generosity for loyalty. I had told myself that stepping in was kindness, that smoothing things over was maturity. What I had really been doing was delaying reality. Thanksgiving didn't create the fracture, it revealed it. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox, handwritten. My son's handwriting, unmistakable even after all that time. He didn't defend her, he didn't justify himself, he didn't ask for money. He wrote that he was sorry for staying silent when it mattered, that he hadn't understood how much had been carried quietly on his behalf, that losing it all had been humiliating but clarifying. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He said he understood why access was gone. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in a drawer and closed it. I wrote back a short reply. I told him I loved him. I told him I hoped he would build something that didn't depend on entitlement or fear. I told him that reconciliation, if it ever happened, would have to be built on respect, not need. I didn't offer help. I didn't reopen doors. Some doors, once closed properly, are meant to stay that way. The following Thanksgiving, I stayed home. I cooked for myself. I set the table the way I liked it. I ate slowly, without checking my phone, without wondering whether I belonged somewhere else. For the first time in years, the day felt honest. People like to call this kind of ending revenge. It isn't. Revenge is loud, emotional, temporary. What I did was permanent. I removed money. I removed access. I removed the illusion that love can survive disrespect. And in doing so, I gave myself something far more valuable than reconciliation. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on cooperation. The solid kind that comes from knowing you did not betray yourself. If someone tells you you're not family anymore, believe them the first time. Not because they're right, but because it tells you exactly how they plan to treat you. And once you know that, the only real power you have is deciding what it costs them to say it. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.